5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. It's Lichtman Live. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Welcome to our astute, brilliant, and withered audience that wants something more than the headlines or the usual blather. Today we are going to explore the great paradox of modern American conservatism.
Oh.
That is the simultaneous downplaying of slavery as though it were a minor blemish in the extraordinary, successful, humane, democratic history of the country, and at the same time celebrating the Confederates who shed blood, were traitors, fought against their own country for the sole purpose of preserving the horrific institution of slavery. We'll explain why they're doing this and then unpack it and show just what a distortion it is of our history and how it comports with something that's been a major theme of this show, that authoritarianism does not rely alone on the use of the military and force, like we've seen Donald Trump doing. It also relies upon controlling what we believe and what we think, and that's what this is all about.
I want to give some shout outs to some people in the chat. Tina says, good evening, friends from Northeast Tennessee. Axel Moreno says, greetings from Houston, Texas. Abe says, we are live. Hello, Krasimir Bornayev, Michael Sheffield. Nice to see you all.
That's wonderful. We not only have a national audience, we have an international audience, right?
Yeah, if you're watching from somewhere outside the States, tell the chat. Let us know in the chat. All right, let's get into it, Dad. Are you ready?
I'm always ready.
Trump is slamming the Smithsonian for emphasizing slavery, calling it, quote, out of control, and warning it's, quote, too woke. This has, Dad, believe it or not, reignited a debate about slavery.
Can you imagine?
Online and in the media. Jillian Michaels, former star of the reality TV show Biggest Loser, now a conservative political commentator, tried to downplay slavery on CNN the other day, saying, quote, do you know that only less than 2% of white Americans own slaves? Trump White House official Lindsay Halligan, who is leading the review of content at the Smithsonian, said, quote, it's not about whitewashing. While slavery is obviously a horrible aspect of our nation's history, you can't really talk about slavery honestly unless you also talk about, quote, hope and progress. I'm sitting next to one of the most prominent historians in the U.S. Hard to believe we have to do this in 2025. But, Dad, can you school us on slavery?
Absolutely. Can you hold this for 1 second? I've got something on my phone that is going to guide us a little bit. Yeah. All right. The right would have us believe that slavery is a minor blemish because they want us to believe that the so-called pioneer generation of white Christian Americans were a great civilizing force in America. They talked about, them settling an untamed wilderness and bringing civilization. Never mind, the enormous indigenous people that lived there that were mostly wiped out in the wake of this. And because of this belief in the exceptionalism of these white Christian settlers, the pioneer generation, they don't want us to believe that slavery was a significant part of the American heritage or a great blot on the American record. And they certainly, and this is critical, they don't want you to believe that there's any legacy of past discrimination, whether slavery, Jim Crow, modern police brutality, discrimination in housing, healthcare, education, mortgage lending. They want to wipe all this out from the American experience and make believe we're a total meritocracy where race, gender, religion, ethnicity doesn't matter at all. And to do this, they create this mythical view of the American past. Slavery was fundamental to the origins and much of the history of this country. Do you know how long slavery lasted in America, Sam?
200 years?
250 some odd years, exactly. From the early 1600s until slavery was abolished in 1865. Now, the right wing and Donald Trump's 1776 project, which represented his politically driven right-wing view of history, says America was the leader in abolishing slavery. I've got some information here on that. Do you think that's true, Sam?
No.
Not even close to being true. The United States abolished slavery in 1865 as the result of a horrible, bloody war that wrought great destruction on the South, from which maybe a lot of it hasn't fully recovered, killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. That would project to many, many millions on today's population. Keep that in mind. 1865. Can you hold this so I can speak to it? Spain abolished slavery in 1811. You can do the math, Sam. 54 years before America abolished slavery. Our neighbor Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, 36 years. The British and its colonies abolished slavery in 1833, 32 years before Denmark and its colonies in 1846, 19 years before. France and its colonies, 1848, 17 years before. And almost every Latin American nation by 1854, 11 years before we abolished slavery. This is part of a much bigger point that I want to make, Sam. Not only do they utterly distort the historical record, but it's not random distortion, is it, Sam?
No.
It's all in pursuit of a particular political agenda. And so, consistent with their view of the superior civilization brought by white Christian settlers, they can't believe that these settlers were somehow a terrible laggard when it came to the abolition of this horrible institution of slavery. And one of the things they also overlook is not just slavery itself was this horrible, inhumane institution, but there's something called the Middle Passage, which was unique to Western Hemisphere slavery. You know what that was, Sam?
The slave trade between Africa and the
exactly
or the Americas.
Over 12 million Africans were brought to the United States against their will, forcefully, in the Middle Passage. And according to historians who studied this, 1.8 million persons did not survive the Middle Passage. That is, in effect, the institution of slavery resulted in the murder. There's nothing, short of that, of nearly 2 million people. That is totally overlooked in the right-wing account of slavery. Then we also have not just the 1776 report giving us the view that they want to impose on everyone. We have the Trump and DeSantis approved Florida curriculum, which was notorious for claiming that slaves developed useful skills. Imagine that. Slavery was so benevolent that it gave useful skills to these horribly enslaved people. Well, what could they do with these skills?
Work for white people.
Exactly. And they couldn't accumulate their own money.
Or wealth, yeah.
Or build wealth. They couldn't have bank accounts.
No property, obviously.
They couldn't buy property or build their own businesses. They couldn't pass it on to their children or their heirs. So, this idea of all these useful skills has to be looked at not as if it was, some free person developing skills, but people in the context of the incredibly oppressive confines of slavery. But not only did they totally misrepresent the facts of slavery's abolition, they totally misrepresented this so-called acquisition of skills. They cited, out of millions of slaves, 16, Sam, who supposedly acquired useful skills. 16 out of millions. It's got to be their best, their aces, their A-plus examples, right?
Right.
Well, it turns out of the 16, 13 were false. Either they weren't slaves or they didn't acquire useful skills. Here are two examples, two of the most outrageous examples. George Washington's sister, his white sister, was named as a slave who claimed that she developed useful skills.
What?
Yes. I mean, these errors are so gross, so horrific, that they boggle your mind, don't they?
Yeah.
Here's another one, Ned Cobb. He was born in 1885. When was slavery abolished? 1865.
Yeah.
So he was born 20 years after the abolition of slavery. And, somehow is listed as one of those having acquired these useful skills. And as I said, about 13 of the 16, maybe not as egregiously as this, but were misrepresented, were false. So not only do they have ideologically driven views of slavery and its place in America and the world, but they utterly fabricate and distort the facts in producing that. And, they also claim, well, the slaves weren't so badly off. They got food, they got housing, they got clothing. Well, let me tell you a story. Way back in 1973, I was at a conference on slavery. And even back then, there was some issue about, how well the slaves were treated. And the late, great historian of slavery, Kenneth Stamp, told a story that summed it all up. He said, a slave named Joe from Virginia escaped, and he was caught and brought back to the magistrate, who knew him. And the magistrate said, Joe, why'd you escape? Was your master starving you? And Joe said, oh, no. My master was a good man. He wouldn't starve me. Well, didn't you have a place to live? And he said, oh, no. My master's a good man. He wouldn't leave me out in the open. Well, he must have been mercilessly beating you and whipping you. And Joe said, oh, no. My master's a good man. He didn't mercilessly whip me. And he said, well, he must have sold your family down the river to Mississippi, right? Joe said, oh, no. My master's was a good man. He didn't sell my family down the river. And the magistrate looked at him really with a perplexed look on his face and said, Joe, you had food. You had place to live. You weren't being beaten mercilessly. They didn't send your family down the river. Why in the world did you run away? And Joe looks at the magistrate and says, sir, the job's still open if you want it. Says it all. Now, this notion about 2% of white Americans owning slaves, that's irrelevant. All that shows is a relatively, even though it's wrong, a relatively...
Right. A lot of people online have already pointing out that is not actually accurate, because if you take into account that only the southern population owned enslaved, only men owned slaves, women and children were not considered slave owners, but they all obviously benefited from being in family. It's
totally wrong.
It's more like 30% actually.
It's 27% of southern households own slaves. That's been documented by real historians, not by people like this guy who just makes things up.
It's a woman.
That's a woman.
Jillian Michaels.
I never heard of her. Is she a historian?
No, she was a reality TV star who's now
that credential certainly would establish her as an authority. 27%. But the real point is not how many white Americans own slaves, which is over a quarter of the southern households, but how many African Americans were enslaved. You know how many African Americans were enslaved at the time of emancipation in the Old South?
I'm guessing like 1 million.
You're not even close. Nearly 4 million. I repeat that. Somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million enslaved persons. That's millions of people under the whip and lash, the horrible system of slavery. That's approximately half of the white population, which was 8.1 million. It's almost half of the white population were enslaved, oppressed peoples. So no wonder the Confederates turned traitor against their country and fought this bloody war to preserve slavery, because slavery was integral, essential. 5 to 4 million forced workers out of a white population of 8.1 million. Plus, of course, they were deathly afraid of slave revolts and slaves slaughtering white people if they were free. In fact, after the freeing of the slaves, just the opposite occurred. White people massacred and slaughtered freed slaves in places like the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana or the Eufaula Massacre in Alabama, as well as many others. So what did the white South do after slavery was abolished? They tried to recreate slavery.
Right.
Through the black codes.
Right.
Which came as close as you possibly could to replicating the horrors of slavery without actually formally reinstituting slavery. The black codes were abolished by the Civil Rights Act of 1966, the Reconstruction Amendments, and other initiatives. Then what happened after Reconstruction was over, Sam?
Jim Crow.
Jim Crow. Whites took over and, again, imposed the system as close as they possibly could to slavery. They snuffed out black voting. They segregated black people. They used the law enforcement system to prey on black people, from an all-white police forces, prosecutors, judges, and juries. And the prisons were about 80% black during this period in the South. And what did they have the prisoners do, Sam?
Slave labor.
Slave labor. First, they had the convict lease system, in which they leased out convicts to work forced labor on private plantations. And then when that faded away, they have something that, we've all seen movies and stories about, the notorious chain gangs. And the chain gangs actually were responsible for building a lot of the Southern infrastructure, including a lot of the modern Southern roads. Forced black labor. And as far as slavery, being a minor blip on the American horizon, as I said, it survived for some 250 years. The slave labor was essential. It was the keystone of the Southern economy, and not just the Southern economy. It was a critical element of the entire national economy. It was Northern merchants and traders who benefited from the slave trade. And monies generated by slavery promoted industry and investments across the country. A major contribution to our economy overall. So my point is, Trump and other right-wingers, and it's nothing new, are utterly distorting our history and our heritage in order to promote their own political goals. Not just distorting how we understand history, but manipulating and fabricating and changing and altering the well-established facts of history. That's why when Trump's 1776 report came out, virtually every scholarly and academic organization in the nation joined the American Historical Association in condemning it as something that was not a work of history, but a totally politically driven document. And you could have seen the foreshadowing of what's going on now in that 1776 report. And even earlier, if you had looked at the textbooks and curriculum of conservative, private Christian academies, which are not controlled, right, by public institutions, but basically they can do what they want. And these distortions about slavery were already present in their textbooks and their teachings. You know, one of the most notorious, outrageous things we found was to call slaves immigrants. As though, like other immigrants, they had voluntarily come to this nation. And of course, no mention of the horrors of the Middle Passage or the nearly 2 million persons who died en route to slavery here in the U.S.
You know, this White House official who said that we need to talk more about hope and progress, I just find that so absurd, especially given their stance that they want to preserve Confederate statues, because those Confederate statues are a sign of the lack of hope and progress.
The opposite of hope and progress.
So, like, again, they're so hypocritical on this. And, you know, with this Trump administration, especially in this second administration, it really feels like every accusation is actually an admission. You know, they've been going on for years about indoctrinating kids with woke
left-wing bias,
right, and critical race theory and all this BS. And then they turn around and do exactly what they've been warning about for years. And 10 times worse.
10 times worse. It's not. It isn't even close. And so these two tendencies are one of a piece. You know, challenge the true history of slavery, distort the history of the Confederacy, and celebrate it. So right. These white Christian Southerners fit within this fabricated history of the advance of white Christian civilization. And by the way, telling the truth about slavery doesn't mean you can't talk about hope and progress, right?
Right.
They're not mutually exclusive.
They're on the National Mall. There's a monument to Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, he was the sign of hope and progress in the modern civil rights movement.
Right. A lot of the hope and progress occurred through those who fought against slavery, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. And by the way, if you look at those Christian conservative textbooks, they also demonize the abolitionists.
Of course.
Yes, of course. And, you know, celebrate the Confederates.
Again, I keep going back to this. Like, I just can't imagine the American, I can't wrap my mind around how American people are buying this, how they think the Trump administration is justified in all this. Like, yep, Confederate statues, we need to keep those up because we need to preserve history. But we need to review all the slavery stuff, but not any of the Confederate. Again, like, I just don't understand who's buying into this.
I wonder. I haven't seen any polling on this, but I can't believe that most Americans are buying into this. But again, this is what authoritarians do. They control information. What was one of the first things, and I'm not comparing Trump or anyone to Hitler, but I'm giving you a little historical perspective on controlling ideas and information. What was one of the first things that Hitler did after gaining power, Sam?
I don't know, but we
burned
the books.
The books.
Got a $100 donation.
Oh, wow.
It's from Stephen. what is it? I can't read their full name. Let me see if I can.
Yeah.
Stephen J. Tenzenspeed. They say, Dr. Lichtman, I'm a big fan of the show and a big fan of the keys. Please keep up the great work.
Thank you. And we really appreciate the donation. It keeps us going. And, I think I mentioned last time when the Soviet dictators took over, they made everyone register their typewriters to make sure that anything they wrote would be in conformance with the political interests of the dictators. And science, social science, even art had to conform to the political interests of the Soviet rulers. And we see the same thing in the Chinese dictatorship.
Yeah. And, again, back to this idea of showing and talking about hope and progress. I mean, they act like when slavery ended, it was like, okay, everything's good now. As you pointed out, I mean, we're talking about another 100 years of horrific laws and treatment of black people in the South. And look, the thing a lot of people on the right wing cry about a lot is like, oh, you're painting white people as evil, you're saying that, white people are... Look, there is a difference between telling history like it is, which is what conservatives claim to be about, and claiming that white people are evil. And nobody's
no one's claiming that.
Right. Again, it's just a distraction from the reality and the terrible arguments they present.
I've been an expert witness in a number of cases in the South and in the Midwest dealing with it's not just the federal government, it's these Republican-controlled state governments that are doing the same thing. And I've looked at, we saw the example from Florida, their curriculum and their attack on critical election theory. And they don't present any body of scholarship in support of this. It's solely driven by people like this Lindsay Halligan, I guess, who have not done scholarly research, who don't have scholarly credentials, who don't have a track record of seeking the truth. They just make things up.
Yeah, I mean, she's just some Trump advisor. She's a lawyer. I mean...
Right. Has she studied and written about slavery? Obviously not, or she wouldn't have, presented such a gross distortion.
It says that she earned a degree in science and broadcast journalism. Oh, she was a Miss Colorado, of course.
Oh, well, that does it up. Okay.
Yeah, and she obtained a law degree. So, she worked in insurance law. She was a lawyer for Donald Trump. Yeah, no evidence that she has any knowledge of anything she's working on within the Smithsonian.
And this whole attack on so-called critical election theory was not developed out of any research.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory was not developed out of any scholarship, any historical perspective. It was ginned up by a political Republican operative by the name of Christopher Rufo, who made all this up because he thought this would be a great wedge issue for Republicans to use against Democrats. And he went way back, pulled isolated, out-of-context quotes from scholars to make it look like critical race theory preached the hatred of white people and of America, when in fact it's just the opposite. Critical race theory is designed to avoid personal attacks, to avoid calling white people racists or promoting hatred. It's just the opposite. Instead, we should focus on structure, on the way discrimination is embedded in the structure of laws and practices, and understand why African Americans and other minorities are so disadvantaged when it comes to education, housing, healthcare, income, wealth. There are reasons for it. So, it's just politicians, in order to gain political advantage, who are guiding this attack on real scholarship and accurate history.
And, the whole thing about critical race theory, somehow it got, again, these mostly college professors and academics and theorists right, we're talking about race in this way. And somehow it got turned into, like, I forgot what year it was, but, there was those years where there's all these people showing up at their high school PTA and local school boards complaining about critical race theory, which didn't even exist in any high school curriculum.
None. And by the way, those people who were complaining about critical race theory, I studied this, they had no idea what it was.
But
they just thought it was, some crazy, liberal, woke idea. But they couldn't tell you what critical race theory actually represented. They had no idea.
Yeah, that's scary because that just shows to me that these people are only engaged in ideological warfare and don't care about the truth.
We've talked about that a lot. How many times have I cited the great late Hannah Arendt, who wrote that once you lose truth, everything else dissolves, because truth is the anvil on which democracy, freedom, and liberty rests.
All right, let's move on to our next topic. You ready?
I'm always ready.
You're always ready. A New York appeals court has canceled Trump's nearly $500 million civil fraud penalty, deeming it excessive, but maintained that he was legally liable for inflating asset values.
Yeah, this was one of the most perplexing decisions.
I still don't really get it.
It's very hard to get, and even the news articles about it don't really explain it clearly. They were like, out of the 5 judges, there were like 3 different opinions, all of which suggested a different outcome. Some wanted it to go back to the trial. Some wanted it eliminated entirely. Some wanted it to go to the Supreme Court. Any rate, Trump regards this as a big victory. It's not. As I said, this was a totally fractured, unclear opinion. But the critical thing was, guess what? They still held you liable for massive fraud. The only issue is how much you should be paying for this transgression. And this appeals court, Sam, is it the last word?
I'm assuming not.
No, it goes to the state's Supreme Court, which may rule, who knows, 6 months, a year from now. It sat in the appeals court forever. But at any rate, Trump is not off the hook, although he hailed this as a big victory for committing massive financial fraud. The only issue is how much should he pay?
Gotcha. Russia, Dad. Russia has unleashed its biggest strike in over a month, hitting western Ukraine with hundreds of drones and missiles, including an American-owned plant, all while accusing Ukraine of rejecting peace talks.
Yeah, this is typical Putin. Blame the other guy. Ukraine caused the war. I didn't have anything to do with it. Even though Ukraine had done nothing, this was purely a gratuitous act of aggression, the worst act of aggression in Europe since Hitler invaded Poland and started World War II. It was all Putin, none of it Ukraine. But he's got a lot of support from the American right in that view. But here's the thing, we talked about this last time. Putin wants to prolong a so-called peace process.
No, you're wrong, Dad. Trump says that he'll be here any minute. Peace is coming right around the corner.
Yeah, Trump said that. Have you heard the Russians say that?
No, in fact, the point is that this proves the opposite.
It's just the opposite, and it's not subtle.
Right.
You don't need to be an historian or a political expert to figure this out. Putin wants to extend this as long as possible, maybe indefinitely until he conquers Ukraine, because he believes he has the advantage. He doesn't care how many of his own people get killed. Totally irrelevant. This is a guy who imprisons and kills his political opponents. So the Russian people, they're cannon fodder. Hundreds of thousands, 1 million or more lives, doesn't matter. All that matters to Putin is his imperial ambitions. And remember, Trump said, got to have a ceasefire, right?
Right.
And if you don't have a ceasefire, the consequences are going to be severe.
Right.
But we didn't get a ceasefire. We got the opposite, an escalation of the war. And what were the consequences for Putin and Russia?
Nada.
Zero. Nada.
That's concerning. Alina Haba. How do you say her name?
Haba. Alina Haba.
Okay, Alina Haba. A federal judge ruled Alina Haba, Trump's pick for U.S. attorney in New Jersey, is serving illegally, citing unconstitutional appointment tactics and disqualifying her from all current prosecutions.
Yeah, this is his personal attorney who had no qualifications to be U.S. attorney in New Jersey, would never have gotten the support of the judges who rule over that. So for this appointment and other U.S. attorneys, Trump has adopted what this judge has now said, kind of an illegal maneuver, putting her in as a special appointee, then as the deputy, which when the U.S. attorney became vacant, moved her into the position without approval of the Senate or of judges.
All right, that's the full take on that.
And I say this goes way beyond just this ruling, because Trump has used a lot of these unconstitutional tactics to put in his loyalists, like his personal attorney, as U.S. attorneys all over the country. Now, of course, this is going to be appealed. I believe the judge put the ruling on hold until the appeals work. So this is not the last word, but it certainly is a very powerful statement. And did we mention that a third judge has denied opening up the Epstein grand jury documents?
No, we didn't. Go ahead.
I think that's worth mentioning. 3 judges now have called Trump out for his obvious deflection, right?
Right.
Remember, Bondi had those Epstein files right in her desk and was ready to release them. And there are no such files. They don't exist. Now, they do exist, and who knows, what they'll release.
Liar.
But as the deflection,
She's a liar.
they wanted to open up the grand jury testimony, which focused on Epstein, nothing to do with whether Trump or any other figure was involved with Epstein. So it was harmless, but grand jury proceedings are sealed. They are only opened if there is a powerful public interest. And 3 judges have said no. And in fact, this judge very explicitly said, not only am I denying this, but I'm going to rule that this was a deflection. There was no public purpose in doing this. The sole purpose was to deflect from the Epstein controversy that's consuming the administration. This is a federal judge saying that, not some random MSNBC commentator.
Right.
All right, I'm ready for questions now, but I felt that deserved at least a mention.
Good work.
Thanks.
All right, before we move on, we have some housekeeping stuff. We have almost 900 people watching, but only 357 likes. Make sure you like the stream. It helps us a lot. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Members and donations get priority in questions. Don't forget that we now have a merch shop, which the link will be in the chat soon. Also, you can pre-order his book. Also, we have now been posting clips of the show, so make sure you check that out. And also, they're very shareable. They're each section of our show clipped out, so it's really easy to share with your friends or on Reddit, X, Blue Sky, wherever you frequent. So make sure you're watching those, you're liking those, you're sharing those, because that also helps us a lot. All right.
Samuel, you're like an IT genius.
This isn't really IT.
Information technology.
Okay. Our first question is from Patrick Murray, one of our good members. Remember, become a member today. Remember, become a member. That's pretty good.
That's really good. We need members because that kind of provides us a stable base. Remember, a lot goes into these shows. I do a lot of research, not easy at my age. There's a lot of technical things that go on. We just don't pop on YouTube and start talking. There's a lot that goes into it, and we need your support.
You just did a whole lecture on slavery.
I did.
You usually have to pay tuition to get a lecture like that.
Yeah, and tuition at American University is not cheap.
No.
or any university these days. But that's a topic for another time.
Someone says I look like Zelensky tonight. I guess with this green,
you do look a little bit like Zelensky.
I guess with this green sort of army
and the
shirt.
kind of little fringe. I don't know. And he's a Jewish guy too.
He is a Jewish guy. Philip H. just donated 5 memberships. Thank you, Philip.
Thank
H.
you. He's an old buddy of ours.
Yeah. Okay. Anyways.
Questions.
Question. They say the 1619 Project argues that part of the reason why the colonists rebelled was because the British were going to abolish slavery. Any truth to that?
Absolutely. It's not the prime reason why the colonists rebelled, but it's certainly an important reason. There were 2 epicenters, remember, of the revolution, right? One was in Massachusetts, but the other was in slave-holding Virginia.
Right.
And if you look at the leaders in Virginia, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, what did they all have in common?
Slave owners.
They all held slaves. And so the fear that the British could undermine the slavery system, which they indeed tried to do during the war by offering slaves freedom if they joined the British side, was an element certainly in Virginia, but not the primary element. Another element that ties into this is that the British were blocking the colonists through the proclamation of 1763 and its later iterations from seizing Indian land in the West. And a lot of these patriots were led by George Washington were land speculators, and deeply resented the fact that they couldn't penetrate into Indian territory and take over their lands, as of course they did once the American Republic was established.
My friend Cynthia Gutierrez says, what can the Smithsonian do to protect its history from this administration?
Very, very difficult. They're part of the government, and I don't know all the bylaws, but it's very difficult internally to resist the American president, who under the Constitution is the head of the executive branch of government. They certainly could engage in passive resistance as long as they can, not changing their exhibits, or if they do it in the most minimal kind of way that creates the least possible destruction. I don't know if private parties outside the Smithsonian or the government could sue, but that certainly is another possibility. But, Trump is the most powerful person in the world, and he's very difficult to resist, particularly given his authoritarian proclivity.
Thank you to Honolulu Water for a $10 donation. This is from Axel Moreno. They said, I forgot to ask in the last discussion, what were your thoughts on Putin saying that the Russia-Ukraine war would have never happened under Trump? That is true. He did give that rhetorical point to Trump.
And that serves everyone. It serves Putin because how do you get to Trump, Sam?
Flatter him.
You flatter him. We saw even the European leaders learning that, giving all this maybe fulsome flattery of Trump. So Putin is doing that for Trump. Plus, it takes Putin off the hook. It was really Biden's fault.
Right, of course.
That this, war took place. If the wonderful Trump had been president, that would have never happened. Remember what Trump said. And again, Trump is not subtle. You don't need to be a political expert or follow every jit and tottle, every bit of the news to understand Trump. He's right out in front. And he came right out in front and said, anything bad is the fault of
Joe Biden.
And anything good is because of
DJT.
Exactly.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for a $5 donation. Putin didn't cite any sort of reason or no, of course not. I mean, there's no reason, or he's just trying to flatter Trump and
take himself off the hook.
Exactly.
Yeah, Putin and Trump are one of a kind. Do they ever take responsibility for anything?
No.
It's always someone else's fault. It's Zelensky's fault. It's Biden's fault. Vladimir Putin, I had nothing to do with it.
The only evidence that actually backs up this claim is that Trump might have given Putin what he wanted. If Putin just called him up and said, "Hey,
I want Ukraine.
I want at least the eastern part of Ukraine."
Yeah.
Trump might have been sure. So
yeah.
there might be some truth to that.
Right. In that crazy way.
Yeah. Why does Clarence Thomas continue to vote against the very programs that got him where he is today?
Yeah, basically he said, I got where I am in large part to affirmative action, and I'm going to make sure that no one else has the same advantages that I have. Remember, he is steeped, even though he's black, he is steeped in this white Christian nationalist tradition. Plus, he hates Democrats and liberals, who he believed besmirched his reputation back, I think it was in 1991, when he was up for confirmation, in his mind smearing him as a sexual harasser and trying to derail his nomination. Never mind, the only reason that his nomination went through, because Democrats had a majority in the Senate at the time, was that a bunch of Democrats voted for him.
Right. Wow, $20 donation from Mandolius. They say, what does everyone think of Jeffrey Sachs' opinions on Ukraine, Europe, Russia, and the U.S., especially Professor Lichtman's opinion?
I can't answer that question because I have not deeply researched Jeffrey Sachs, who I respect, but I don't always agree with opinions on every one of these issues.
Gotcha. Thoughts on the Supreme Court being formally asked to overturn same-sex marriage by Kim Davis. And if you don't know Kim Davis, I believe she was the woman in Kentucky who was trying to do something. I can't remember.
She was trying to deny marriage certificates to same-sex couples, despite that being the law of the land. I don't think she's acting alone.
No.
I don't know, but I'm pretty sure she has higher-level sponsors. And certainly Clarence Thomas and Alito and maybe others have opened the door to overturning the ruling legalizing same-sex marriage. This court has shown no inclination to respect past rulings that they don't agree with, like Roe versus Wade. So, yes, I think this is not all Kim Davis, but part of a right-wing effort to overturn the Supreme Court ruling legalizing same-sex marriage.
This is from Formetta What. Thank you for your donation. They say, Professor Lichtman, in 2024, we saw how powerful figures like Elon Musk use their platform and wealth to amplify misinformation. Looking ahead to 26 midterms, do you believe voters will be more aware of this influence?
I sure hope so. It's one of the purposes of this show is to combat misinformation and to the best we can try to give accurate information. But remember, voters are not fact checkers. They don't follow political events all that closely. Most can't name even their member of Congress. So the big lie perpetrated by Musk and others has worked for authoritarians throughout history. Say something loudly enough and often enough, and people will come to believe it. But I hope, and we're beginning to see the glimmer of this, that Democrats will grow a spine and much more forcefully, vigorously, and persuasively try to counter what's going to be another onslaught of misinformation.
With gerrymandering locking down Texas, what can voters actually do in 2026 to fight back and protect democracy?
Well, Sam and I have discussed this quite a bit, and I think he's come around to my point of view, that Democrats need to counter, and we're seeing that already in what Gavin Newsom is doing to counter the Texas gerrymandering with a gerrymandered redistricting of his own. And by the way, that's catapulted the fact that he has a spine right to the forefront. It's still early, and I'm not predicting anything, but right to the forefront of potential Democratic presidential nominees in 2028. And by the way, again, it doesn't mean anything at all except a snapshot of how Gavin Newsom has elevated his profile in the head-to-head match. Again, not predicting anything from this, just pointing out what it means at the moment for Gavin Newsom. He's ahead of J.D. Vance.
I want to clarify. I right now I'm feeling like I am for temporary gerrymandering to, again, balance out the gerrymandering that's happening in Texas, but I'm also for a national ban on it.
So am I, and I've been speaking out on that for years.
Heck yeah, dude.
And it's before Congress, and Republicans have blocked it.
True. There is some question whether the redistricting violates the Voters' Rights Act. We know the High Court made a new law by repealing parts of it arbitrarily, so I would not expect much opposition to the Texas action.
I'm not sure what High Court they're talking about there and what they've repealed, but the highest court, the U.S. Supreme Court, has said no federal court can even deal with political gerrymandering, that states are free to gerrymander no matter how egregiously, and there is no relief to be had from federal courts. And I don't think there'll be any relief for this redistricting in Texas from the Texas Supreme Court, which is 100% Republican.
Allan, how can voters in Texas stand their ground if ICE tries to intimidate them at polling places?
I'm really frightened about that because Trump has used something called presidential declarations of national emergency to do anything he wants, including, militarizing law enforcement. And I'm very worried he's going to declare a national emergency for the electorate and station ICE and FBI and National Guard to intimidate particularly minorities at the polling place. I think in advance of the election that lawsuits have to be prepared and even filed. And people have to understand that this is their right, and they've got to be courageous enough to go ahead and vote and not be intimidated. This is a very, very serious breach of our democracy, something I hope won't happen, but I'm very fearful of it happening. If it does, it would be a breach of our democracy, unlike anything we've seen before, but we've never seen before an insurrection like that which Trump supported on January 6th for the first time in over 200 years to impede the peaceful transfer of power, which is an essential bedrock of our democracy.
Speaking of ICE and immigration, we maybe should have talked about this at the top of the show, but this is fairly breaking news about 2 hours ago. This is from the Washington Post. They say the Trump administration to vet all 55 million foreigners with U.S. visas. The State Department plans to scour legal visa holders for, quote, overstays, criminal activity, threats to public safety, or providing support to terrorist organizations. That's pretty big news. They're going to review all 55 million U.S. visas?
I didn't think there were 55 million U.S. visas.
I mean, this is from the Washington Post.
Does the Washington Post say there are 55 million, or does the Trump administration say there are 55 million?
It's not clear.
I don't believe there are 55 million visa holders. Remember, there are only 340 million or so people in the country, and that counts babies. So 55 million is what, 1/6 of the entire American population, even counting babies?
It says that just in 2024 they issued 11 million. That's what the Washington Post says.
I guess it's possible there are 55 million. I haven't researched it. I'm a little... But that's beside the point. Yeah. The real point is the Trump administration is essentially racially profiling immigrants. As I've said, this is another fabrication that immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, are these dangerous, cutthroat, violent criminals who pose a clear and present danger to our safety. Is that true, Sam?
No.
The opposite is true. There are multiple studies, including by the Libertarian Cato Institute, whack-out liberal organization. There are 3 levels of crime in America. 1, undocumented immigrants. They commit the lowest level of crime in America for good reason. They do not want to get involved in the criminal justice system. Second is legal immigrants. They commit the second lowest level of crime in America. Final tier, native-born Americans. And guess what? They commit the highest level of crime in America. So once again, in justification of this attempt to terrorize people who are here legally, much less alleged undocumented immigrants, they are fabricating a story about the danger that immigrants pose to America. No reason other than terrorizing immigrants. And not just immigrants. You know, immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, are married to U.S. citizens, right?
Right.
They have kids who are U.S. citizens. So the terrorizing goes vastly beyond the so-called 55 million immigrants here on temporary visas, or the so-called undocumented immigrants. It spreads across the American population. And in effect, there's no check on this. What check is there on ICE, Sam?
None.
And they're now spending tens of billions of dollars to beef up ICE and expand these horrific detention centers, which violate, as far as I can tell from reports, the part of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which says there can be no cruel and unusual punishment.
$7 donation from May O. They say there is a YouTube video saying the Civil War was also a big slave revolt. Do you think Lincoln was given too much credit for ending slavery?
It's absolutely true. The great historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction, Eric Foner, points out how blacks facilitated their own freedom in the South by fleeing from the bonds of slavery, and many of them joining the Union Army and fighting against the Confederacy and slavery. Have you ever seen that famous movie Glory?
Yes, I like it.
Can you tell us what it's about?
It's about a black regiment during the Civil War.
Right. Engage in an incredibly bold, courageous attack, acquitting themselves very well and suffering, major casualties. So yes, we've got to give a lot of credit to the black people themselves. Doesn't mean we shouldn't give enormous credit to Abraham Lincoln. The two are not mutually exclusive. But yes, it was a big slave revolt as well.
All right, we got about 3 minutes, so we'll do one or two more questions.
I'm up for it.
How do you feel about alternative voting systems like ranked choice voting and STAR? How important of a role do you think getting rid of first past the post plays in the future of this nation? What can be done to ensure that the next Trump doesn't get elected?
Well, ranked choice voting, I've talked about it before. I think it's an excellent system. That is, you don't just vote for one person, and whoever gets a plurality in most states then wins, or in a couple of states you have to have a majority so you get a runoff. This enables second, maybe even third preferences to count. And it's particularly useful for minority voters and minority parties. The problem is it can get a little bit complicated and difficult to understand, so we would need a lot of education before we adopted this, but it's certainly an idea to be seriously considered.
This is from my friend Tupac M. They say, I think it would be good to remind folks how money got into politics in the first place and discuss why America hasn't been able to reform things it has desperately needed to. For example, getting rid of the Electoral College, our first past the post voting system, and getting money out of politics.
So this is a question for the last 1 minute, huh?
Well, we have a minute and 30 seconds to be
All right.
cool.
I'll try to answer it as succinctly as I can. A clear majority of the American people wants to get rid of the Electoral College. I mean, keep that up.
Sorry.
And elect presidents by majority vote. But why isn't that going to happen anytime soon, Sam?
Nobody in
It requires amending the Constitution.
Nobody's in politics is actually going to do it.
Yeah, it's just not going to happen. Same thing with past the post voting systems, although that doesn't necessarily require a constitutional change. It would require a lot of voting changes. Getting money out of politics. You know, way back in the early 70s, in the post-Watergate reforms, I thought we might be doing it. But the Supreme Court, like they have done so many times, opened the floodgates to money in politics with the Buckley v. Vallejo decision from the mid-1970s, which essentially equated money with speech, which made it almost impossible to effectively regulate money in politics. And then the Supreme Court, in cases like Citizens United, has expanded on that doctrine, also ruling that corporations have, when it comes to contributions, the same rights as persons. So these incredibly rich corporations can throw as much money as they want in politics. So given that, again, it would require a fundamentally different Supreme Court or a change in the Constitution. You know, unfortunately, the old golden rule of politics still holds, and it's very, very sad. He who has the gold rules. Of course, the other alternative would be a robust system of public financing, but
not under this administration.
The politicians are not going to let that through.
All right, with that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for the evening. The good news is the Lichtman Live post show comes up right after this. There's 800 people watching Lichtman Live. I expect at least 400 of you in the post show. If you've never watched the post show before, give it a try. It's fun. It's chill. I guarantee you'll like it.
You'll love it. It's not as heavy as this show, is it?
How do you know? You've never watched it.
Well, you've told me. I believe you.
You go chill out after the show.
I go chill out. And your mom, I really need to chill out. I put a lot of energy and effort into this show, into, trying to get you as best as I can to the truth. So all I can say is continue to dedicate yourself to the truth. And to the best of our ability, we need to fight to the end fabrications and distortions of our heritage and our society. And keep in mind, understanding the flaws, the wars against the Indians, slavery, Jim Crow, does not mean that it's mutually exclusive with also talking about hope and progress in American history.
Good point. All right, another quick shout out to some donators: Gabrielle, Happy Valley Farms, Andrew Beard, Honolulu Water, Green Entertainment, and Steven for the $100 donation. All right, I'll see you guys on the post show. Say goodnight, Dad.
Good night. See you Tuesday.